Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a fascinating sociological study and combining it with some seriously deep historical data to basically map out the DNA of American identity. We're going to look at thousands of years of human history to understand exactly who we are today.
So let's jump right in by starting with a really provocative question from sociologist Deborah J. Schildkraut. Is our increasingly multicultural society creating a multicreedal America? In other words, as our demographics shift in the 21st century, is the actual normative content, the core rules and values of what it means to be American, fundamentally changing right now?
To get to the bottom of this, Schildkraut tests something called the multiple traditions theory. She's essentially investigating whether everyday people share just one monolithic definition of Americanism, or if it's actually a massive, complex web of different and maybe even contradictory norms. It's a pretty fascinating way to look at how we view ourselves.
Here is our agenda to figure this out today. First, the identity question. 2, the first inhabitants. 3, a tapestry of tribes. 4, the European arrivals. And finally, 5, the multiple traditions theory.
Section 1. The identity question, defining who we are. You see, Schildkraut's study emphasizes that we really have to look past simple definitions here. To truly understand if modern diversity is changing our identity, we've got to measure a wide-ranging set of norms. A lot of public opinion research tries to shove identity into one tiny box. But let's be real, human societies, especially this one, just rarely fit into a single metric.
Section 2. The first inhabitants. 30,000 years of history.
Okay, to really grasp this complex web today, we have to rewind the clock, like way back. The story of diversity here actually kicks off tens of thousands of years ago. It starts with the Paleoindians following game across the Beringia land bridge from Eurasia into North America, perhaps as early as 30,000 years ago. Fast forward to 10,000 BCE, and humans were well established all across the continent. They adapted over time, right? Going from hunting giant Ice Age megafauna like actual mammoths to foraging, and eventually around 8,000 BCE, we see the very first farming practices popping up in central Mexico.
Section 3. A tapestry of tribes. Diverse early societies. Now, as these early populations expanded, they absolutely did not form a single uniform culture. The variety was incredible. Over in the east, you've got the Hopewell tradition running vast trading networks all the way up to Lake Ontario. Out in the southwest, the Anasazi were literally building massive stone and adobe apartment-like pueblos straight into cliff faces. Up in the Pacific Northwest, you had affluent societies built around salmon, who threw these elaborate gift-giving feasts called potlatches. And looking beyond the mainland, native Hawaiian civilizations were settled by Tahitian explorers around 1200 CE, while the Arawak people settled Puerto Rico, flourishing into the Taino culture. It was a completely vibrant tapestry of distinct cultures.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that early America already had highly sophisticated and vastly contrasting systems long before any European ever set foot here. Think about the contrast. On one hand, you have the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, which was a deep, complex political alliance of 5 tribes represented by 50 Sachem chiefs. On the flip side, you have the Mississippian culture, which operated as this massive economic hub with huge agricultural cities, sprawling trade networks, and a highly structured class system.
And speaking of those Mississippian cities, there's a massive number we need to talk about, 20,000. That was the estimated population of Cahokia, located near modern-day St. Louis in the 12th century. To put that into perspective for you, Cahokia was actually larger than London at that exact same time. Absolutely wild, right? The whole city was centered around a gigantic 100-foot-tall earthwork known as Monk's Mound.
Section 4. The European arrivals. A collision of cultures.
All right, that brings us to the next huge demographic shift, European arrivals. But, and this is key, it wasn't just one unified event. It was a layered collision. First, you've got early Norse explorers hitting Canada way back around 1075, which is just astonishingly early. Then centuries later, the Spanish arrive in the 1500s across Florida, Texas, and the Southwest. Then the Dutch set up New Netherland in the mid-Atlantic in the 1600s, and of course the British settled Jamestown and Plymouth in 1607 and 1620. We're talking about entirely different languages, traditions, and creeds hitting the continent in waves.
Now, Europeans brought over new goods like horses and cattle, which definitely changed the landscape, but that was completely overshadowed by something devastating: Eurasian diseases. Explorers introduced pathogens like smallpox and measles, and because Native Americans had zero immunity to them, it resulted in horrific epidemics. This caused massive, tragic disruption and the decimation of those complex indigenous societies we just talked about. It really was a violent and catastrophic collision of worlds.
Section 5. The multiple traditions theory. Modern identity.
So, having just walked through this staggering 30,000-year history of colliding and combining cultures, let's loop back to the present day. Schildkraut's empirical data actually perfectly mirrors our history lesson. Her research concludes that no, you cannot reduce American identity into a single creed. A broad range of rules and values, constitutive norms, exist. The data flat out proves that to define what it means to be American today, you have to acknowledge multiple traditions.
And here is where it gets really interesting. The study finds that a vast majority of Americans today, about 85%, actually share this complex, multi-layered view of our national identity. And what's truly fascinating is they share this view regardless of their own ethnic or immigrant background. Now sure, there are some signs of divergence to monitor, sitting at about 15%, but the overwhelming consensus fully embraces a multi-creedal reality.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Basically, our modern, multi-creedal identity isn't some brand new phenomenon brought on by 21st century immigration. It's actually the logical, inevitable result of this continent's deep, incredibly diverse history. From the hundreds of distinct Native American societies to the fractured waves of European colonization, this land has literally never known a single monolithic creed.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question as we look forward into the 21st century. How will this continuous, never-ending collision of cultures shape the American traditions of tomorrow? Because if history tells us anything, American identity isn't some finished monument. It's a living tapestry, and we are still weaving it right now. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.